I have a Christian friend who told me recently that she doesn't read the Old Testament because there's no Jesus in it. But while there is no Jesus in the Old Testament, there is lots of Old Testament in Jesus. Jesus taught in the synagogues and was recognized as a rabbi who spoke with authority. In fact, about 10% of what Jesus is recorded as saying in the New Testament is taken from the First Testament. Jesus clearly saw life and our relationship with God through the lens of the Torah. For him, as for all first-century Jews, there was no scripture other than Torah. Torah is the foundation of his ministry. In all this, Jesus never contradicts Torah. He accepts its authority. When Jesus seems to differ with Torah, he is always actually differing with the ways in which popular culture and the religious authorities interpret Torah. Jesus calls us to interpret all the words of Torah through the guidance of the Spirit, keeping God's love in the forefront. Torah, and more broadly the entire Older Testament, including the prophets, was the water through which first-century Jews swam. Throughout the Old Testament, the writers quote from the Older Testament 300 times. This is how they and Jesus understood the world, and the scripture of Torah and the Old Testament becomes the underpinning of all Christian thought. But let's just look at a few examples from the Gospels, places where Jesus makes direct reference to the Torah to provide meaning and context to his teachings. First, let's look at the Gospel of Matthew, in which Jesus provided context and further instruction for a passage from Exodus. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, give your coat as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Give to the one who asks of you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you." Jesus often used the construction, "you have heard it was said," to refer to things written in Torah. In this case, he is referring to Exodus 21. "If any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe." Though Jesus' instructions might appear to be in opposition to the law revealed in Exodus, it is really an extension of the same sentiment. Far from being intended as a call for extreme punishment, an eye for an eye in Exodus was a call for proportionate punishment to be carried out through official channels, rather than the common practice of individuals carrying out extreme punishments against those who had injured them. Jesus responds to those who would take an eye for an eye, literally, to bring us the heart of Exodus's meaning: seek justice, not retribution. In the Gospel of Mark chapter 10, Jesus' adversaries are trying to trap him into saying something they would consider blasphemous. Then, as now, the question of divorce was controversial. The Gospel reads, "Some, testing him, asked, 'Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?' He answered them, 'What did Moses command you?' They said, 'Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of dismissal and to divorce her.' But Jesus said to them, 'Because of your hardness of heart, he wrote this commandment for you. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female.'" Here Jesus is referring both to the law of divorce from Deuteronomy chapter 24, which says, "Suppose a man enters into marriage with a woman, but she does not please him because he finds something objectionable about her. So he writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house. She then leaves his house and goes off to become another man's wife." And also from Genesis chapter 1. "So God created humans in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them." Again, this is a place where it seems that Jesus is countermanding Torah. But in fact, he is extending the laws of charity and justice. In the first century, women were largely powerless. They could not seek divorce. They could not even prevent a divorce if their husband wanted one. There were no communal property laws, no alimony, and it was nearly impossible for a woman to earn enough income to live on. If a man divorced his wife, she would be destitute, unless she could find another man to care for her. The law of divorce, Jesus tells us, was written because of our hardness of heart, because men would seek ways to put away their wives, and Moses recognized this. Jesus, though, calls us to do better. A woman in this culture needed a husband to care for her. Jesus further invokes the creation story. God made them male and female to underscore the divine responsibility we have for one another. Now, this is a somewhat odd example that illustrates not so much Jesus' interpretation of Torah as it illustrates how familiar Torah was to Jesus and to those around him. In the Gospel of John, chapter 8, Jesus says of himself, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." The Pharisees, in an attempt to say that his word isn't trustworthy, invoke the Talmudic notion that the evidence of a single witness cannot be accepted, referring to Deuteronomy chapter 17, which says, "On the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses, the death sentence shall be executed. A person must not be put to death on the evidence of only one witness." They tell Jesus in John chapter 8 that because he is testifying on his own behalf, his testimony is not valid. Jesus counters that they are judging him by human standards, which he does not accept. But even by those standards, his testimony is valid because it comes not only from him, but by God the Father as well. Scripture says, "Then the Pharisees said to him, 'You are testifying on your own behalf. Your testimony is not valid.' Jesus answered, 'Even if I testify on my own behalf, my testimony is valid because I know where I have come from and where I am going. But you do not know where I come from or where I am going. You judge by human standards. I judge no one. Yet even if I do judge, my judgment is valid, for it is not I alone who judges, but I and the Father who sent me. In your law it is written that the testimony of 2 witnesses is valid. I testify on my own behalf, and the Father who sent me testifies on my behalf." The Great Commandment is the name we give to one of the most important instructions Jesus gives us. It's so important, in fact, that it's included in slightly different forms in all 3 synoptic Gospels. In it, Jesus summarizes all the law and the prophets. That is, all of Torah. It's put most succinctly in Luke's Gospel. "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." I think that most Christians are familiar with the Great Commandment, or at least the command to love God and to love one another. What many do not know, however, is that it is based directly on 2 verses from the Torah. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18 says, "You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5 includes the injunction to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your being, and all your strength. It is the fundamental instruction Jesus gives us for how we are to live our lives as Christians. It is also fundamentally an instruction of the Torah. Not only that, Jesus was not the first person to say so. Much of the Great Commandment is included in the Shema Yisrael, a prayer that devout Jews have said daily from the 1st century BCE up to today. It consists of 3 separate passages taken from the Torah. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 9, and Deuteronomy chapter 11, verses 13 through 21, and Numbers chapter 15, verses 37 through 41. Jesus' great commandment directly echoes a portion of the Shema. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, and as for you," this is the part, "you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength." So what does all this mean for us as Christians, and particularly for our search for a new pastor and a new preacher for our congregation? Well, it is clear that Jesus revered Torah and taught it. He was respected as someone who spoke with authority about Torah. All of Jesus' teachings are through the lens of Torah as he understood it. Therefore, for us to understand Jesus, we must ourselves understand Torah. A pastor and a preacher who, like Jesus, values, studies, and strives to understand and to teach Torah is essential to the Christian life of the congregation. I hope that you'll agree that this trait is an essential quality for the next priest of our congregation. If you'd like to study and examine on your own, I provided a few resources that you can use to help you. Thank you for your attention, and God bless.